All right, so it is 7 p.m., so let's go ahead and get started. Tonight's keynote speaker is someone whose podcast I've listened to for a very long time, at least a few years now. I actually heard about his podcast here my first time at the Midwest Peace and Liberty Fest, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, great to meet him, and today we'll just be doing a Q&A, ask him anything, and here's Brett Veinotte.
I didn't know this was a keynote speech. I didn't know it was being called that. But at this point in the day, you guys are exhausted with speeches. So when Joe first asked me to come here, I said, yeah, pick a topic for me. I'll talk about whatever you want. And then he gave me like 3 suggestions, and I said no to all of them. What were they? Relationships, and the other 2 were so unappealing, I don't remember them. But then we started, he said to me, this is a good overlap of your audience, so people would probably have questions for you about your show, about education, about what you learned on your trip across America, where I saw all kinds of alternative education in homes and in schools. And I just preferred that format to make sure that everybody who comes here gets as much of what they want as possible. So why don't we begin? Well, what actually happened is Joe was supposed to be here and explain all this. He and I drove Scott Horton to the airport. I interviewed Scott Horton for the first time I've done this show for over 9 years. I've always wanted to interview Scott, never knew about what. We had a delightfully awkward interview as he sat in the front seat of the car and I sat in the back seat of the car. And then he missed his flight and got back in the car. We did a little more interview, and then Joe drove him to Detroit to try and catch the same flight, but at another airport this time, where it's landing in about an hour. So that's where we're at, and I will take questions. Scott.
Yes. Ask him what? She wants to know how he got back here. How you got back here if Joe's got the car.
Joe dumped me off at the end of the driveway and sped off to try and make it to Detroit by 8:30.
Okay, so let's get back into it. I want to talk about the possibility or lack thereof of seeing meaningful liberty in our lifetimes. And just to define that better, the dissolution of the state, basically. Majority of people do not want a state, and it can no longer be sustained, and we no longer have this system called a state. Is it realistic to expect that that's a possibility within our lifetimes, in your opinion?
This is kind of like what a lot of us signed up for, right?
Yeah, I mean, assuming that's a noble goal, and most of us are interested in that, and that is a major thing that we would like to see.
Okay. I have many answers for this question. Show of hands, who thinks that is possible in our lifetimes at this point? This half of the room. Some people on this half of the room and one guy Patrick on that side of the room. No problem.
Do we define what liberty in our lifetime?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you for coming. I think when we first heard that idea, and certainly feel free to follow up with anything that I'm going to say. For me, there was an ideal. Can you just actually elaborate a little bit more about why you're asking that and what you're hoping to get out of it?
Yeah.
Because I'm saying for me that the answer is, and this was actually going to factor into a speech that I was going to give, but it was too negative and too doom and gloom, so I decided on this format instead. And a lot of my revelations around the time of the last presidential election and the fallout from that election, it was really disheartening. It was really discouraging. It was scary.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the left or the Trump supporters, but it was also a lot of people in my own Facebook group and a lot of things that were happening inside the liberty movement that I found really discouraging. And I really started to rethink the idea of liberty in our lifetime. To get back to what Alex was asking for, was a clarification in the dissolution of the state and sort of reframing the idea as individual liberty and a way to project or signal that to other people in a way that it was attractive. Now, obviously,
All right, so it is 7 p.m., so let's go ahead and get started. Tonight's keynote speaker is someone whose podcast I've listened to for a very long time, at least a few years now. I actually heard about his podcast here my first time at the Midwest Peace and Liberty Fest, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, great to meet him, and today we'll just be doing a Q&A, ask him anything, and here's Brett Veinotte.
I didn't know this was a keynote speech. I didn't know it was being called that. But at this point in the day, you guys are exhausted with speeches. So when Joe first asked me to come here, I said, yeah, pick a topic for me. I'll talk about whatever you want. And then he gave me like 3 suggestions, and I said no to all of them. What were they? Relationships, and the other 2 were so unappealing, I don't remember them. But then we started, he said to me, this is a good overlap of your audience, so people would probably have questions for you about your show, about education, about what you learned on your trip across America, where I saw all kinds of alternative education in homes and in schools. And I just preferred that format to make sure that everybody who comes here gets as much of what they want as possible. So why don't we begin? Well, what actually happened is Joe was supposed to be here and explain all this. He and I drove Scott Horton to the airport. I interviewed Scott Horton for the first time I've done this show for over 9 years. I've always wanted to interview Scott, never knew about what. We had a delightfully awkward interview as he sat in the front seat of the car and I sat in the back seat of the car. And then he missed his flight and got back in the car. We did a little more interview, and then Joe drove him to Detroit to try and catch the same flight, but at another airport this time, where it's landing in about an hour. So that's where we're at, and I will take questions. Scott.
Yes. Ask him what? She wants to know how he got back here. How you got back here if Joe's got the car.
Joe dumped me off at the end of the driveway and sped off to try and make it to Detroit by 8:30.
Okay, so let's get back into it. I want to talk about the possibility or lack thereof of seeing meaningful liberty in our lifetimes. And just to define that better, the dissolution of the state, basically. Majority of people do not want a state, and it can no longer be sustained, and we no longer have this system called a state. Is it realistic to expect that that's a possibility within our lifetimes, in your opinion?
This is kind of like what a lot of us signed up for, right?
Yeah, I mean, assuming that's a noble goal, and most of us are interested in that, and that is a major thing that we would like to see.
Okay. I have many answers for this question. Show of hands, who thinks that is possible in our lifetimes at this point? This half of the room. Some people on this half of the room and one guy on Patrick on that side of the room. No problem.
Did we define what liberty in our lifetime?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you for coming. I think when we first heard that idea, and certainly feel free to follow up with anything that I'm going to say. For me, there was an ideal. Can you just actually elaborate a little bit more about why you're asking that and what you're hoping to get out of it?
Yeah.
Because I'm saying for me that the answer is, and this was actually going to factor into a speech that I was going to give, but it was too negative and too doom and gloom, so I decided on this format instead. And a lot of my like revelations around the time of the last presidential election and the fallout from that election, it was really disheartening. It was really discouraging. It was scary.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the left or the Trump supporters, but it was also like a lot of people in my own Facebook group and a lot of things that were happening inside the liberty movement that I found really discouraging. And I really started to rethink the idea of liberty in our lifetime. To get back to what Alex was asking for, was a clarification in the dissolution of the state, and sort of reframing the idea as individual liberty and a way to project or signal that to other people in a way that it was attractive. Now, obviously, all of us can't have it in every single area of our lives, but some of us enjoy, great freedom of mobility because of the kind of work that we're able to do. There's plenty of people where I came from in New Hampshire who enjoy a tremendous amount of lifestyle independence because of things like Bitcoin and entrepreneurship. And, finding that strength or that thing that you can model or that thing that you can show to other people and project it outward, as I've tried to do with my show, and finding a way to do the two things that I love to do, which was teach, and ever since I was very little, I wanted to be like a broadcaster, and I thought it would be sports. And I figured out, I was very lucky that I came along when I did at this time and was able to figure out a way to do those two things together on my own terms. So I try to be very public about that. But so many people are doing cool things like that. And I think that's an example of liberty in our lifetime that we already have now. But
what about that not having a state example?
Yeah,
I want to focus,
but that's the reframing.
Like a laser beam on that.
Right. I have given up on that idea as far as, and I think a lot of other people have too, even if they haven't stood up in front of a group of people with a microphone and said that, I don't really think about that very much anymore. And when I did think about it a lot, like when I was new to these ideas and I was very passionate and very belligerent and wanting to convert other people and prove that I was right, I was sending a tremendous amount of, energy and attention that I needed for myself, improving my own life financially, physically, mentally. I was projecting it into things that I could never have any control over. The Federal Reserve, presidential elections, and the results were generally negative for me. For everything inside my sphere of control, the results were bad because I put all my energy and attention and emotion outside of that sphere. So I think that personal liberty in our lifetime, even if it's not complete, is attainable in more and more ways if we just operate in our sphere of control. But I wanted you to elaborate on why that was an important question to you.
Yeah. I think for me, because when I first discovered this concept of liberty, non-aggression principle and so forth, and learned that the state is utterly compatible with this.
Yeah.
And what a great idea this would be, how much everyone's lives could be improved if people would embrace this. I realized that there's a great wisdom here, that everybody's missing. And I was really excited to share that with other people.
Yeah.
And have that be received by other people. And at that time, it certainly seemed possible that other people could embrace this because it was essentially truth. I felt like I was dealing with truth. I had this great truth that I could share. And then, of course, people were not very receptive to that. There was a variability and receptivity. A person here, a person there, I would bring into the movement. Mm-hmm. And I'm sort of like you. I sort of backed away from that to focus on trying to improve my own happiness, my own life, what I want to do on a daily basis. But I kind of miss those days. I miss those days of feeling like there's a truth here that can be shared. There is some way that I can assist other people in embracing it.
Yeah.
And it can be made into a juggernaut, that can't be stopped. And we can actually have freedom defined in that way as not having a state anymore within our lifetime. Like this is something that could be within our reach. And I've really seen a lot of that sentiment, at least in the people around me, sort of drop away. And I kind of miss some of that energy from that time period.
Yeah. It's exciting. This is something that Scott and I were talking about, in the car on the way to the airport wasn't it fun to be a conspiracy theorist? Wasn't it fun to just be a conspiracy kook? You know, wasn't the world so simple? And didn't you know more than everybody else? And wasn't that just, it was fun, it was exciting, there was new conspiracies to discover. And I felt like when I went from being that to I went from being a liberal, which was awesome because I had all of the best shame tools, and I know something you don't know, and how dare you, and how can you even live with yourself for not caring about these things that I care about, to the whole conspiracy realm and Alex Jones and Coast to Coast Radio, and you know the wake up people kind of thing, to this. I mean, it was a perfect transition into this, and I think that I really embraced it because it felt like moral and intellectual, easy, like prepackaged, just hand me moral and intellectual superiority. We were talking before, and you said, what's the effect that people, when a crowd comes together around a leader?
Well, I was talking about that people have a huge interest.
You know, as I studied communication and things like negotiation, I've realized that if you can take your ego out of these things and learn to embrace a person's no, or embrace a person's opposition to these ideas, you actually have a starting point, you know? And one of the best known books on negotiation is called Getting to Yes, right? And it's a very logical, like, step-by-step guide to how to reach the negotiation that you find favorable. But one of the problems with the book is that it assumes the parties are logical. If you're talking about the education of somebody's children, if you're talking about a philosophical container in which a person has lived their entire life without ever questioning it, if you're talking about left versus right in politics, you're not dealing with rationality, right? How many people have heard of the concept, show of hands, because it's the best way to do it in the dark. How many people have heard of the elephant and the rider? 1, 2, half maybe. For those of you who don't know, that side, this is the elephant and the rider side. It's the idea that the rider is our rational mind. It weighs at most 160 pounds, right? It's a little Indian man. The elephant is thousands of pounds, and that's our emotional brain, right? And if you ever want a chance at interacting with the rider, you have to be able to calm the elephant, right? You have to be able to deal with that, and you have to be like willing. You don't deal with it as an inconvenience, right? I mean, I used to say on the podcast all the time years ago is like, you can't get people won't think logically because everybody's forcing them to think emotionally, right? And that's a problem with other people that awesome, like enlightened folks like us don't have. I mean, that was my presentation on that. And what I realized from having more and more into these discussions and just failing at making real connections with people was like, those are the means, right? Understanding what's alive in that person when these topics activate them, and being willing to hear that and willing to accept their denial of what you're saying, their negation of what you're saying, their opposition to what you're saying, embracing that no is a really, really good starting point for actually having productive discussions with these people. But I just had Groundhog Day after Groundhog Day after Groundhog Day because all I was doing is, I know something you don't know, I'm intellectually and morally superior, and I'm here to feed my ego. And as I started to look at like the political landscape in 2016 and 2017 and the ridiculous fallout of Donald Trump getting elected president and the ridiculous reasons why people said they voted for Donald Trump, for some reason, I don't know what it is, I just turned inward and looked back at myself and all of my behaviors. I thought so much of like the social justice left is such a perfect mirror for so many things that happen in libertarianism, and all of these bad techniques and bad approaches and just being driven by ego and wanting to feel superior to people was such a big part of my motivation for even getting involved in this, you know? So when you talk about liberty in our lifetime, what a phenomenal, grandiose idea to embrace and carry the flag of, right? But how beyond any one of us as an individual, like as individuals, is it, you know? Yeah, Scott, more.
Well,
when you compare it, but when you compare it to the quest for personal or individual liberty in the ways that you can show it to other people to work maybe towards that bigger goal.
I guess sometimes I get frustrated when I hear people discuss how what can one person do? I mean, this is too grandiose for one person to make a difference. Can't we go back through history and see movements where one person or two person or three people have made a difference? And I can't cite you specific examples. Chattel slavery might be one of them, the abolitionist movement. I know we're all still slaves. I realize, I get that. But at least that one aspect of slavery that was widely socially, culturally accepted is no longer accepted. And it seems like in some of these cases, you can have that one or two or three people that made a huge difference. I mean, do we need to throw that out, that possibility? Doesn't that take motivation away from a lot of people that could possibly make a difference? On the face of
you could be right. My impulse, and I will definitely stand corrected if necessary, is to reject that idea, because I think the way that we learn history, and this was like one of my observations as a history teacher, was like they make really being an agent of change inaccessible to most people, right? Like most of the really important transformative movements towards like real social justice or real freedom for more people were not the work of one or two people, but they're presented that way in the history book. Who's responsible for black people having civil rights in the United States? Shout out the names.
Oh, to be like Martin Luther King.
Okay.
Yeah. Rosa
Parks. You just named most of the entire civil rights movement as far as most people are concerned, right? So it's absolutely been sanitized to the safest, cleanest, state-friendly stories, right? Did Rosa Parks one day, as the history books say, this is what a public school history textbook says about Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks one day decided that she was tired of sitting at the back of the bus. And she said, today's the day that I sit at the front of the bus. And she did. This was something that happened all over the South. That was coordinated by huge groups of passionate and courageous people who said, okay, you get on the bus here and do this. They will take you off the bus in handcuffs and bring you here and we'll bail you out. Right? Over and over and over and over again, they did that. Martin Luther King was one of, I mean, how many people have read Renegade History of the United States? Right? A lot of overlap. No, there was. I thought there would be more overlap between me and that. But, he talks about the diversity of that movement. But as we go back through history, they just kind of pick and choose the most sanitized stories. But what's great about Martin Luther King? What's great about Rosa Parks? They're heroic. They're almost inhuman. What they did is inaccessible to the average person, right? So I think most of those movements probably look more like this, where there's a room full of people saying, yeah, what do we do? Or what's the best way to do this? Or where are we right and where are we wrong? It was frustrating in New Hampshire because, I mean, even though New Hampshire is a small state, people came there with this idea of liberty in our lifetime, but then they sort of fractured into these different communities that then isolated themselves and kind of built this insularity, like Keene is civil disobedience. So they turn their backs to everybody who says, stop doing so much civil disobedience. You're hurting the people who are trying to make headway politically, which I never really wanted to be a part of, but I've seen the case for like political participation as a kind of defense in recent time. But like being able to come together and ask these questions, that didn't happen there. And that movement kind of fractured in a lot of ways where it became counterproductive. I think most of those movements looked more like this than one or two heroic people making a difference. But that's just like my first, like that's the impulse that I throw at what you said.
But let me ask you this.
Sure.
If you think back, can you think of maybe one or two key people where at some point they said something to you and something clicked that made a huge difference in your life and your happiness? Like if it wasn't for Guard Goldsmith, I would not be an anarchist.
Why?
It was one podcast he did where he explained some things. At the time, I'm a Constitutionist, right? Mm-hmm. Just got to go back to the Constitution. And he explained the nature of the Constitution, essentially the nature of the state, right? They're violating your rights in the name of protecting your rights. And I was like, oh my God, they do, and that clicked. And that sent me down a completely different path.
It was, for me, I would say the person I would give the most credit to was Wes. And Steph kind of really finished me off pretty forcefully. But I remember it was the end of 2006, beginning of 2007, and I was painting a house and going through all of whatever existed of Complete Liberty podcast at that time. And I went, oh shit, I think I have to call myself an anarchist. It was, I don't know how to build the bridge between where I feel is really the right place to be and how do I even talk to anybody else about this, right? It just felt like I was isolating myself from the world, but he had made such an ironclad case for the philosophy of liberty. And it was one of the first interactions that I had. It was before I ever heard Steph, before I ever had read Rothbard or Ayn Rand or anything like that. It was me just with this guy in my headphones. He was actually the first person I ever reached out to and said, I would like to talk more with you because, yes, he had that impact on me.
And I think it would be safe to say that you have probably reached a lot of people.
I hope so.
Been a catalyst for major change in people's lives.
I like to believe that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just have this fear that, don't waste your time trying to change other people or trying to engineer what you do in a way that will complete that outreach, that connection, that will catalyze those changes.
That I'm saying don't waste your time?
Yeah, kind of.
No, I think that...
Or that you're pointed in the wrong direction, if you have the intention to reach other people and have them change their mind about something in particular.
I think I was pointed in the wrong direction by how I was trying to reach other people. I think that before I said anything, sometimes I had to go through all of the content that I produced recently, all the way back to 2009. I had to go through every web page on the website to kind of rate the value of everything that was there and decide what to keep and what to discard. And I was listening to some of the old stuff, and I said, God, I didn't know shit about anything when I started doing this, and people thought I did, or compared to now. But it's all there and it's all out there. I just think that and maybe people need that. They need that belligerent approach. They need that anger at the beginning to get hooked. But it just never worked in the real world. When I found people who were already sort of trending this way and they heard me talk that way, maybe I made some kind of connection. But in the real world, it never worked. It took actually showing people these are the results of the things that I've been talking about in the real world, right? In my actual life. And I think that's it's not abandoning outreach. I think that's a way more effective kind of outreach because it's projecting out after you put all of your energy and attention into yourself first, or as much of it as you can, into yourself before, going out and proselytizing about things.
Yeah. Oh, at the time, your early podcasts, that had a lot of appeal to me, the sort of jackal and all the judgment that was built into it. And I liked it at that time. When I got in my own discussions with people and wanted to share ideas and I had veins sticking out on the side of my head, I discovered that, this isn't fun for me. Mm-hmm. Going about it this way is not going to be fun. I have to learn a different way.
The genesis of most of my early podcasts were things that I made mental notes of on the way home from Sunday dinners, right? When I said, when my uncle said this, you know what I should have done? I should have said this, right? Yeah. And I write it down and then slip it into a podcast like it was some natural, clever thing that I came up with. It was all just an outlet, just all this stuff that had nowhere else to go. Most of the stuff I had to say about school was things that I couldn't say in meetings because I'd get fired or I'd lose my clients. And most of the things I had to say about politics were from missed opportunities in dinner table political conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's when you hear those things, it's yes, I can identify with that, and you can build people you bring people in and build trust around that identification, I think.
And I don't mean to detract from what you're saying about personal freedom. I mean,
Yeah.
I want to reiterate it because the state can go away tomorrow, and if I don't address and do my homework internally, I'm not going to feel happy anyway, right? I'm not going to find personal fulfillment in my life, even in a stateless society. You know, what good is that goal if I don't achieve the happiness that I want?
I agree. And scale that up, right? To, like, if the state goes away tomorrow, that would be anarchy, right? That's a joke. Like, people picture things when you say that word, right? In this world, if that happened, that would be anarchy. Yeah. Unfortunately, when it could be something so much more wonderful and peaceful and beautiful. I see a lot of, like, the youth today wanting, like, this thing that just happened with the gun stuff. Where was that? Parkland, Florida. And all these kids got really active around the idea of gun control because they had been given this, I guess, worldview from their teachers and from the mainstream media. It's very similar to the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, right? They're being given the facsimile of an education or a facsimile of enlightenment. Rational people, what do they call it? Common sense gun reform, right? Rational people think this way about guns. This is the only rational way to think about guns. Now you go out and spread this message, and if you had just been sitting in a desk for like the last 12 years of your life doing meaningless, boring work, and somebody gives you an opportunity for even the illusion of making a difference in the world, I would have gone for it at that age. I was going for it when I was much older than that. So I think that all of those kids who jumped on that, even though I was really pissy about, in my observations of it on the show, I said, I can see myself doing that. I can see myself doing that at 30 years old, where I attached my identity to the most important idea that I can possibly fathom, right? The end of the state. Now I know, what did Stefan Molyneux say? It's raise children the right way, and then someday that will happen. Sweet, now we know how it's gonna happen. I'm not gonna be around to see it. There's no accountability meetings. In the meantime, there's no benchmarks to progress. It's just like, do this thing, preach these ideas, and do this thing, and then someday the state will end. I see a lot of that in more mainstream political activism today. People want to feel like they're making some kind of difference, but they don't want to be held accountable for, they want it to be something that's so far away from themselves that they never have to be held accountable for change not happening. Does that make sense? Yeah. Thank you so much. That was an awesome question, Scott. Guys, I think this is the move. I call this cool counselor. This is.
Hey, Brett.
Patrick, thank you.
Do you think there is a marketing problem with libertarianism? And if so, how would you solve it?
Tell me more.
So, the word anarchy is a loaded term. The word libertarian has been muddled and watered down, I think, in recent years. I think especially on the political level with people like Gary Johnson at the helm, right?
Yeah.
And I know some of us probably prefer the term voluntarist or voluntarism better than libertarian or anarchist. And there's a lot of terms that are being used to all kind of point in the same direction, but I don't know if it's helping to spread the message as effectively as it could. How to make it more palatable for the real people in the real world.
Do you think freedom resonates with most people?
Yes.
Do you think, so I think this actually relates to the last conversation that we were having, and like breaking it, when you're talking about like changing a system,
yeah.
Right? Like anarchy or even voluntarism, even though most people don't know what it means, like anarchy is obviously, it's going to be a big change for most people.
Right.
Right? Things are going to be different. and you can even see that divide in that sort of little narrow container in which everybody's already decided to exist in, of left and right. Like even switching from one side of it to the other is, catastrophic.
Right.
From or at least they, pretend like it is.
Yeah.
But I think that most people, I mean, if we just kind of divide things into life that are into two categories, right? What's enjoyable and what sucks, right? Well, the things you choose for yourself, the places where you have ownership, the places where you have control, the places where you have autonomy.